that were to be proven scientifically, then we would have to announce to the whole world that no one should believe in rebirth. We should stop believing in rebirth. And Sagan did not expect that. He was expecting a more of a dogmatic reply. But then the Dalai Lama gave him the counter question, how would you do that? How would you prove that there is no rebirth? How indeed? The criterion in science, that is, if you want to make a claim and establish it as science, is falsifiability. You need to be able to set up a test in which you could conceivably show that your hypothesis is not true. I don't need to tell all the scientists in the room this is what we do all the time. But how would one go about establishing that a center of consciousness has left a particular physical body at death and then re-entered or re-identified with another physical body somewhere else in the universe at the moment of either birth or conception or somewhere in between? How would one do that? It seems to be an impossible task. The most promising avenue for reincarnation research, past life research, seems to be past life memory. That is, the claim, taken usually by small children between the ages of 3 and 6, that they have vivid memories of some other place and time, and of being another person. I want to introduce you to what I find in the studies I've done to be the most interesting such case. This is Ryan. Ryan is an American boy from the state of Oklahoma. If you are familiar with the United States, Oklahoma is in what we call the Bible Belt. People in this part of America many of them are very devout Protestant Christians. Ryan's parents were Southern Baptists. They do not believe in rebirth, and in fact, the idea of rebirth is seen by many of them as something evil, something not good, the work of the devil, and so on. So they were not people who were inclined to believe in rebirth. At a very young age, Ryan began crying to go to his other house in Hollywood, where he had a swimming pool. And he started to describe this entire other life, where he'd been married 5 times, where he had danced on Broadway, where he had met famous movie stars, and he wanted to go back to that other place. And of course, to Brian's parents, that sounded like a childish imagining, but he was so disturbed by it, he was so upset, he so wanted to go back to that other life, that they consulted a child psychiatrist, Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, who studies cases of this kind. Ryan's case was especially interesting to Dr. Tucker. Over the course of this series of events, Ryan and his mother were looking at a book about the golden age of Hollywood, the 1920s, 30s, 40s, old movies. And they turned a page, they saw a photograph, and Ryan became very excited. He pointed to a man in the photograph and he said, "That's me, that's my other life." Well, the man in the photograph was not a famous movie star. Very often, skeptics of past life research will say, every woman who believes that she has been born before, has lived before, was Cleopatra, and every man was Julius Caesar. So this is some kind of wish fulfillment, right? They can't all have been Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. But this was a very obscure person, and so once they established contact with Dr. Tucker and his team began doing research, carefully keeping the information away from Ryan and his family so there would not be a contamination. If Ryan learned this information and it became incorporated into his story, this case would be over, because a big question about this research is leading questions and the imagination of the child. So they want to try to elicit authentic information from the child. So some research was done, and the man in the photograph was identified as a Mr. Marty Martin, who was not a famous person, but he was a Hollywood agent. He was in the photograph because he had a very brief part in an old film that starred Mae West. Mae West was the big star of the film. He played a gangster who stood in the background and didn't say anything in the film. But later in his life, Martin became a Hollywood agent. Earlier in his career, he had danced on Broadway. He was married 5 times. One thing that Ryan said was that his old house was on a street that had the word rock in it. Martin lived on Roxbury Boulevard, and numerous other details from his life began to surface that were a perfect match with what Ryan was saying about his old memories. And this was not a famous man. This material was not available on the internet. It was not something Ryan could have heard by hearsay. And his family in Oklahoma had no connection with Martin's family. He has living daughters through whom much of this information was gathered. And the most striking moment of all in this entire episode was when Ryan made the comment, spontaneously, not in the course of an interview. He made the comment, "I don't understand why God would make you die at the age of 61 and come back as a baby." Well, when this was reported to Dr. Tucker, he said, well, this does not fit Marty Martin, because according to Marty Martin's death certificate, he died at the age of 59, not 61. But that's not the end of the story, because follow-up questioning with Martin's daughters proved that, in fact, his death certificate was incorrect, and he actually did die at the age of 61. So Ryan's memories actually corrected the public record of the death of this man with whom Ryan had no connection. So this is a very interesting case. So we'll return to Ryan shortly. He's the most important thing about this most interesting thing about this entire presentation. But I want to back up and talk about the philosophical and scientific context in which Ryan matters. So, if we're interested in this concept of rebirth, one question we have to ask ourselves is there even such a thing as consciousness independent of the brain? And the very widespread view among most neuroscientists, at least in the Western world, is that no, there is not. If there is consciousness independent of the brain, rebirth is possible, because the center of consciousness, called in the Jain tradition the jiva, can in effect move from body to body. It's not tied to the body in any permanent way. Reincarnation research thus becomes a potential avenue for scientific inquiry. It becomes something interesting. But if not, if, as many scientists believe, there is no rebirth because there is no consciousness independent from the brain, then past lives are not a worthwhile avenue of investigation. And this is why so little of this work has been done. It's really seen as kind of loony from the point of view of mainstream science, which does not accept the idea of consciousness independent from the brain. The view that consciousness is a product of brain chemistry and reducible to brain activity is widespread among neuroscientists. One thing I want to say right at the beginning, and I'm sure there are neuroscientists in the room, this does not apply to all neuroscientists. There are neuroscientists who hold other views, but this is the mainstream view among neuroscientists in America, certainly the ones with whom I've been able to interact. But the identification of consciousness with brain activity is not a scientific conclusion. It is an a priori philosophical assumption, a view that is known among philosophers as materialism. Does the brain cause consciousness? This is the view of many neuroscientists who accept a materialist view. But it's also possible, it's completely consistent with our current best science on the brain, that the brain is a vehicle for consciousness, that it may be something akin to a transmitter. Multiple philosophical answers to these questions, materialist and non-materialist, are logically compatible with the findings of neuroscientists. So in other words, one of my purva paksha, right, the view with which I'm taking an exception here, is the idea that science has proven that there's no consciousness independent of the brain. Take a television set or a radio, for example. If the brain is more akin to one of those, if it's a receiver, then we can think of the following analogy. You're watching television. You're watching your favorite film by Shah Rukh Khan, let's say. And Shah Rukh Khan is dancing on the screen and singing. It's actually someone else singing, play over, but he's there and doing his thing. And suddenly your TV breaks. No more Shah Rukh Khan. Has Shah Rukh Khan ceased to exist? No. The signal that was being beamed to your television, either through cable or satellite or whatever means you had, has been interrupted because there's been a malfunction in the hardware of the television. If the brain generates consciousness, then when the brain dies, consciousness ends. That's the materialist view. But if the brain is a receiver for consciousness, then when the brain dies, you won't see any more evidence of consciousness, just like you won't see Shah Rukh Khan on your television. But you can rest assured that Shah Rukh Khan is still dancing happily somewhere, and that consciousness still exists, still resides somewhere in the cosmos. It may be that the brain does not generate consciousness but acts as a receiver, and I was told this very recently, just during my last couple of weeks here in India, that there's some evidence that it may even be an inhibitor of consciousness. People often ask, why don't we remember our past lives? And there are a lot of good philosophical answers for that, if you believe in rebirth, such as that we need to get on with our lives here, that the memories from the past would interfere with our current existence, as they did for Ryan. They were very psychologically troubling for him until he reached about the age of 7 and started to forget all about it, which seems to be the pattern with many of these children. So the brain may need to block out a lot of consciousness that is there in the jiva so that we can fulfill our karmas, so that we can exist as we do here on earth. A brain may be, as I just said, analogous to a radio or a television. So the scientific data is mixed. You can interpret brain science in a materialist fashion. That's, in fact, the mainstream view of the people who know the science very well. But it's also possible to interpret it in a way that's very consistent with Jain thought. But we don't believe in rebirth, those of us who do, because of science. Like materialism, a worldview that includes rebirth is not a scientific conclusion, but a matter of a prior philosophical commitment or of a dharmic or religious conviction. Karma and rebirth address important ethical and existential questions. This is why I was drawn to the idea. It helps me make sense of all the horrible things that happen in the world and in my own life, and also the many good things that happen. We had a funny incident today. Some of you might even know about it. I feared we were going to delay the bus a little bit because my wife's shoe broke, and she's now very embarrassed and hiding her eyes, but sorry. But there was a man there who was on the scene and immediately, and this would not happen in America, by the way, probably not in Europe either. There was someone right on the scene who could repair the shoe, and it was ready in a minute, and we came on ahead. And we were thinking about this. I was thinking, was it bad karma that my wife's shoe broke? Or did it give her an opportunity, or did it give this other man who repaired the shoe an opportunity to do some seva and to do some good karma? Right? All of these things that happen to us are interconnected. And we can say that it's random and that it's pure material process. But karma and rebirth give us a way of looking at our experience that helps us make sense of it and helps us get through life. For many of us who accept it, reincarnation is affirmed on the authority of the testimony of sages, whom we believe to have recalled their past lives through yogic perception, such as the Tirthankaras of Jainism, who are believed to have achieved such a state of pure oneness with the jiva, pure conscious awareness, that the brain was no longer blocking the signals, and they had perfect awareness of all of these things. This is not solely a matter of faith, for such perception is in principle possible for anyone. This is what I personally find fascinating about Jainism and some of the other Indian traditions as well. This was not a special revelation. It's not that God came to Mahavira and said, you have these many past lives, and therefore we now all have to take his word for it. The practices that lead to such realizations are in principle available to anyone. So I won't say it's science, but it's science-like. It has that kind of in-principle availability to everyone that a special revelation doesn't have. Well, what's wrong with materialism? I'm going to beat up on materialism a little bit here. It's, again, a philosophical position, but its adherents rarely give it a proper defense. Now, I want to quickly add, I'm aware that there are, in fact, very good, very rigorous philosophical defenses of materialism that exist. But this is not what we typically find when we're having dialogues with neuroscientists. It's simply assumed to be scientific and true. And many of us simply assume that the scientific worldview equates to materialism. So it's rarely given a serious defense. Developments in quantum theory show that materialism is in many ways outdated from a scientific perspective, that what many people take to be scientific materialism is pretty much a Newtonian worldview. It's about 300 years behind the times. Scientific observations, such as the famous double-slit experiment, demonstrate that the act of observation plays a major role in the determination of the outcome of an experiment. The double-slit experiment, for those of you who are not familiar with it, and here's where I'm going out on a limb because I'm not a physicist, but it involves the observation of light And it shows that the expectation of the observer can affect and can even determine the outcome of the observation, whether the light acts as a particle or as a wave. And in fact, more elaborate versions of the experiment have shown that when the act of observation occurs, and this is going to sound really weird, but I'm sure there are physicists who will vouch for this, it is almost as if one's act of observation goes back in time by an infinitesimal amount and changes the outcome and affects the outcome. So this suggests that consciousness, awareness, is not some added thing in the universe, but is intrinsic to it. Consciousness is thus not external, but intrinsic to the very nature of reality, not a byproduct of accidental chemical activities in the brain. In Jain thought, the jiva is one of the 7 tattvas and one of the 6 dravyas. In other words, when the Jain tradition wants to talk about what is fundamental to reality, the Jain acharyas have generated these lists of entities, and these are not reducible to anything else. Everything else in the universe can be reduced to the 6 dravyas, for example. But the jiva is one of the 6 dravyas. So that means consciousness, which is an intrinsic characteristic of the jiva, is intrinsic to reality itself. It was not created later. It did not emerge or evolve later. Similarly, it's one of the 7 tattvas, one of the foundational principles of Jainism in the Tattvartha Sutra. It is listed as a fundamental principle of existence. Jiva is, in other words, an irreducible and fundamental element of existence.